He said no one could love someone as broken as her, that her past made her too complicated, too emotional, too much. So he walked away. But what he never expected was that the woman he left behind would become a voice for millions, that her pain would become her purpose, and that the only thing truly broken was his idea of love. My name is Grace Nolan. I survived things I never thought I'd speak aloud. Trauma that left cracks in my voice and shadows in my chest. I was never asking for pity, only for space. Space to be messy. Space to be healing. But the man I loved looked at me and saw damage. He told me I was too broken for the life we planned. And then he left. But I didn't break. I rebuilt. And in the ashes of his abandonment, I found the one thing he never gave me: peace. This is the story of how I rose, not despite the pain, but because of it. And how healing became my loudest form of revenge. Grace Nolan had learned early that silence could be a survival tool. She grew up in a house where the floors creaked like warnings and love sounded more like slammed doors than soft words. Her father carried anger in his fists, and her mother carried fear in her silence. Grace became an expert at reading moods, holding her breath, and pretending she did not notice the chaos. By the time she was 12, she had already decided two things. She would never raise her voice like her father. She would never let anyone make her feel like she was hard to love. But trauma is sticky. It wraps itself in your ribs. It whispers in your relationships. And even when the yelling stops, the echo stays. In her 20s, Grace started therapy. Not because someone encouraged her, but because she was tired. Tired of waking up with panic in her chest. Tired of ruining good things before they even began. Tired of being afraid of herself. Her first therapist, Maria, was a woman with a voice like warm tea. She asked questions slowly, waited for the answers, and never flinched, even when Grace shared the ugliest parts. "I feel like I'm too complicated," Grace had said once. "Like no one wants to sign up for this." Maria looked at her calmly. "You're not complicated. You're healing. And the right people won't run from that." For a while, Grace believed her. And then she met Evan. He came into her life like a breath of fresh air, charming, smart, soft-spoken. He listened when she spoke, laughed at her jokes, and brought her coffee just the way she liked it. She told him about her past slowly. She tested him with bits and pieces, afraid that if she said too much, he would vanish like the others. But Evan didn't flinch. Not at first. In fact, he told her he admired her honesty. That her resilience was beautiful. That he'd never met someone so open, so aware, so strong. Grace thought maybe, just maybe, this time was different. They moved in together after a year. She left toothbrushes in his drawer, bought plants together, merged Spotify playlists. She even brought him to therapy once, and he sat beside her, holding her hand, nodding as Maria explained how triggers worked. But slowly things changed. He stopped calling her strong, started calling her dramatic. He rolled his eyes when she had flashbacks, asked her if she could just let it go already. He stopped coming to therapy, started saying things like, "I didn't sign up to be your therapist too." Grace began to shrink again. She started apologizing for crying, for being overwhelmed, for having too many emotions. She began skipping therapy sessions to avoid arguments. Pretended she was okay when she was not. The house got quieter. One night, after a small disagreement spiraled, Evan said it. The sentence that broke the last fragile hope she had. "You're too broken, Grace. No one wants to live like this forever." He said it like a fact, like it was something obvious. And then he left. No warning. No long explanation. Just a single suitcase and a key left on the counter. Grace sat on the floor that night, holding her breath the way she used to when she was small. But this time, no one came to rescue her. And maybe that was the blessing. Because she realized she did not need rescuing. She needed rising. In the days that followed, grief came in waves. Not just grief over Evan, but grief over the belief she had clung to for so long, that if she just got better enough, someone would finally stay. But now, Now she was done trying to earn basic decency. She returned to therapy, but not to talk about Evan. She talked about herself, her triggers, her childhood, her body's memory, her needs. She started going to trauma-informed yoga, journaling every morning, and attending a women's support group for survivors. For the first time, she said it aloud in a room full of strangers. I was abused. I was neglected. And I carried shame for years that never belonged to me. The women in the room did not pity her. They nodded, because they knew. And in that shared knowing, Grace found something sacred: community. She no longer felt like a burden. She felt understood. One day, Maria asked her, "What does healing look like to you now?" Grace smiled softly. "It's not about being perfect. It's not even about forgetting. It's about not hating myself when the wounds reopen." She paused. "And it's about not trying to be lovable to people who only want easy things." A few weeks later, she started a blog. It was anonymous at first, just a space for her to write about trauma, therapy, and the journey of piecing yourself back together. She titled it, "Still Soft, Still Strong." The first post was simple. "They told me I was too broken to be loved. But maybe the cracks let the light in. Maybe softness is a form of strength. And maybe healing isn't pretty, but it's holy." Within a month, it went viral. Women from around the world began messaging her. From Spain, South Africa, Pakistan, Brazil, Kentucky. "Your story feels like mine. Thank you for putting words to something I never could. I thought I was the only one who felt this way." Grace was stunned. What she thought made her weak had become someone else's oxygen. She was not just healing. She was helping. The blog turned into a podcast. The podcast turned into speaking invitations. Then came a TEDx talk. She stood on that red circle in a simple black dress, holding nothing but a handheld mic and her truth. And she said, "I used to think healing meant being fixed. But healing, real healing, is not a destination. It's a homecoming. It's choosing yourself again and again, even when the world says you're too much to carry." The room gave her a standing ovation. Grace stepped off that stage and into her new life. One she had built with bare hands, late nights, and shaky courage. Not for a man, not for a label, but for the little girl inside her who had waited so long to be held by someone safe. And finally she was. Grace never expected to become a voice for survivors. She started writing to survive her own pain, to trace her feelings in sentences when her heart was too tired to say them aloud. But somewhere between her blog posts and the podcast mic, she became more than a survivor. She became a mirror. Women and men reached out daily now, some anonymous, some desperate, some young, some older. They shared stories they had never spoken before. Stories of fathers who hurt them, partners who left them, families who called them liars. And through it all, they wrote the same words over and over. "Your voice made me feel seen." Grace read every message. Every line carried someone else's weight. And yet, none of it dragged her down. Because she was no longer drowning. She had learned how to swim in the storm. One morning, she received a message from a university professor who ran a trauma psychology course. "Your TEDx talk is now part of our required viewing. Would you be open to speaking with our students?" Grace stared at the message, stunned. She replied yes, heart pounding. The day she walked into that classroom, she wore a soft beige blazer and minimal makeup. Her voice still shook slightly when she began, but she did not shrink. She shared her story, not just the abuse, but the aftermath. The way trauma lives in the body, how it sneaks into relationships, the guilt that comes with surviving. She paused before the final line. "I am not your inspiration," she said gently. "I am proof that healing is possible, even when it's ugly, even when it's slow." The students applauded. A few cried. One came up to her afterward and whispered, "You helped me realize I'm not crazy. I'm just hurt." That night, Grace sat in bed holding her journal. She wrote, "Every time I thought I was being punished for my past, I was actually being redirected to my purpose." The next few months moved like a dream. She was invited to conferences, retreats, even a guest panel on a mental health podcast with millions of listeners. But amidst all the momentum, she made one rule for herself. Stay grounded. Stay honest. Stay human. She kept going to therapy. She still had bad days, panic attacks that came without warning, moments of self-doubt, nights where the silence felt too loud. But the difference now? She had tools. She had language. She had grace for herself. One day, her therapist Maria said something that struck deep. You're not healing to be lovable. You're healing because you already are. Grace cried after that session, not out of sadness, but because it finally made sense. She had spent years trying to be low maintenance. Easy, quiet, neat. But she wasn't messy. She was layered. She wasn't fragile. She was rebuilding. And she deserved to take up space while she did. It was around this time that she ran into Evan again. She was speaking at a mental health fundraiser downtown, and as she stepped off stage and greeted attendees, she saw him in the crowd. He looked surprised. Older. Worn. His shoulders slumped in a way that suggested life had not gone the way he planned. Grace, he said, stepping closer. She gave a polite nod. Hi, Evan. I didn't know you'd be here. I mean, I saw your name on the flyer, but I thought it couldn't be you. She said nothing. I've been following your stuff. The podcast. The talks. You're everywhere now. Still, she stayed silent. I just wanted to say I'm sorry, he continued. For how I left. For what I said. You weren't broken. I was just weak. Grace looked at him calmly. I know, she said. He blinked. You do. She nodded. I figured it out a long time ago. I just didn't need to hear it from you anymore. He swallowed. I've been working on myself, trying to understand things better. She smiled gently. That's good. I hope you find peace. And then she turned to greet another attendee. Evan stood there for a moment, unsure, and then walked away. Grace didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, how satisfying it would feel to be the one standing tall, to see regret on his face. But when it happened, she felt nothing but calm, because healing had already given her the closure he never could. Later that night, she posted a message on her blog. Healing isn't revenge. Healing is waking up and realizing the person who broke you no longer has a say in your worth. Her audience responded in waves. One message read, You're the closure I've been searching for. Another said, You just described the conversation I wish I could have had. Thank you for helping me let go. But the message that stayed with her came from a woman named Jordan. I'm a trauma therapist, and I use your words every week to help people believe and hope again. Thank you for being brave enough to say what so many of us carry in silence. Grace stared at the message for a long time, and then she cried, not out of grief, but because something beautiful had finally settled in. Her pain had become someone else's roadmap, and nothing Evan could have given her, not an apology, not a second chance, not even regret, could compare to that. She was not just surviving anymore. She was leading. Grace stood in front of a mirror backstage, adjusting the tiny microphone clipped to the collar of her blazer. It had become routine now, flashing lights, early flights, headlines with her name. Yet somehow, before every big speech, the same feeling swelled in her chest, a flutter of nerves, not from fear, but from something deeper. Responsibility. She was about to step on the stage at the National Women's Health Summit. The crowd waiting behind the curtain included doctors, therapists, survivors, journalists, even policymakers. Some of the most influential voices in trauma advocacy were seated just feet away from where she would soon stand. A young assistant peeked in. You're up in 5, Ms. Nolan. Grace nodded, smiled, and took a deep breath. She opened her journal, one she always carried in her bag, and read a line she had written months earlier. I don't speak because I've healed. I speak because healing deserves a voice. Then she stepped into the light. The applause was loud. A sea of faces, all waiting, all watching. Grace began without notes. When I was 22, I believed I would never be enough for someone to stay. I thought love was something I had to earn by shrinking myself, by staying quiet, by bleeding without making a mess. She paused, letting the silence land. But I was wrong, and I am standing here today to tell you, you are not a burden. You are a miracle in progress. A woman in the front row wiped a tear. Another nodded slowly, arms folded over her chest, face tight with emotion. Grace continued, weaving her story into lessons about how healing is not linear, about how triggers do not make you weak, about how self-worth is not handed to you by a partner. It's something you reclaim, one shattered piece at a time. Afterward, a small crowd formed at the edge of the stage. Among them was a woman in her 50s with graying hair and eyes that held too many years of silence. She didn't speak at first, just took Grace's hand and said, "You told my story out loud. Thank you for not being ashamed of us." That moment meant more than any headline, because Grace had learned that the truest validation never came from applause. It came from connection. That night, back in her hotel room, Grace curled up in bed and thought about how far she had come. She remembered the girl who cried in bathroom stalls, who flinched at raised voices, who once believed her trauma made her unlovable. And she whispered to that younger version of herself, "Look at us now." In the following months, Grace's advocacy expanded beyond speaking. She partnered with licensed trauma therapists to build an online platform called Unbroken, a safe, anonymous space for survivors to access therapy resources, write their stories, connect with others, and learn practical healing tools. The goal wasn't to go viral. It was to create safety where none had existed before. The platform grew rapidly. Within 6 months, it had over 40,000 members in 20 countries. People posted at 2 a.m. when the memories returned. They replied to each other with kindness, shared playlists for anxiety, wrote letters to their younger selves. Grace didn't moderate alone. She hired a team of trained survivors and clinicians. It wasn't a business. It was a home. One night, she received a handwritten letter in the mail. No return address. Just neat cursive on cream paper. "Grace, I was going to take my life last year. I had everything ready. And then I heard your podcast episode about choosing yourself, even when you feel broken. I played that episode on loop for 3 hours. And I stayed. Thank you for saving me, even if you didn't know you did." Grace held the letter to her chest and cried. Not from sadness, but from awe, because she had once begged the universe for someone to save her. And now, somehow, she had become the light for someone else's storm. In therapy the next week, Maria smiled as Grace shared the letter. "You're no longer just healing for you," she said. "You're healing for everyone still stuck in silence." Grace nodded. "But I'm still learning." Maria tilted her head. "And that's what makes you real." Grace had no desire to be a perfect survivor. That narrative exhausted her. She still had nightmares. Still had moments where touch felt unsafe, even from someone kind. Still caught herself flinching at certain words. But now she had language, and boundaries, and breath. She had learned to pause instead of spiral, to rest instead of punish, to speak instead of swallow. Around this time, she received a message from a university offering her an honorary doctorate in mental health advocacy. Grace laughed aloud when she read it. Not because she didn't feel honored, but because the girl who once believed she'd never finish anything was now receiving honorary degrees. She flew out for the ceremony in a navy suit with her hair in soft curls, no flashy jewelry, just a simple lapel pin that read, "Still here." She stood on stage again, this time in front of young students who had studied her work, watched her TED Talk, read her articles. "Some people will tell you to forget the past," she said. "But forgetting isn't healing. Healing is learning to carry the past without letting it crush you." She was met with standing applause. Later that evening, she returned to her hotel and opened her laptop. There, sitting unread in her inbox, was a message from Evan. She had not heard from him since the fundraiser. She stared at the subject line. "Grace, I watched your talk." She didn't click it. She didn't need to. because she already knew what it would say. Apologies, regrets, admiration, maybe even longing. But Grace had already made peace with that version of her life. She closed the email. Then she opened the unbroken dashboard and replied to a new member who had just posted, "I'm scared to begin therapy. I'm scared it'll make things worse." Grace typed gently, "I used to be scared too. I thought healing would break me even more. But what I've learned is that the pain doesn't grow in therapy. The truth does. And truth, even when it hurts, is what sets you free." Then she hit send and went to bed. Not broken, not perfect, just free. The fall air was crisp as Grace walked through the downtown art gallery with a coffee in hand and a notebook in her bag. She had been invited to a private exhibit called What Healing Looks Like, an emotional collection curated by survivors of trauma through paintings, sculpture, and handwritten letters. At the entrance, a sign greeted her. Not all wounds bleed. Not all warriors wear armor. Sometimes, healing wears lipstick and carries keys. Grace stood there for a long moment before stepping inside. Each piece told a story, some abstract, others painfully raw. There were canvases filled with dark swirls and tiny bursts of light. Sculptures shaped like broken mirrors, reassembled with gold. Notes pinned to the wall that read, "I am still here. I forgave myself before I forgave him. Healing didn't fix me. It freed me." As she moved through the space, she saw a group of young women clustered near a corner display. They were whispering, pointing discreetly. One of them turned, noticed Grace, and froze. "You're her," she said. "You're Grace Nolan." Grace smiled gently. "Yes, I am. I listened to your episode on self-worth, the one where you talked about how you stopped apologizing for existing," the girl said. "It changed me." Grace stepped closer. "What's your name?" "Isla," she said. "Thank you, Isla," Grace replied, "for listening and for staying." Later that day, Grace found herself sitting on a bench outside the gallery, notebook open, writing slowly. "I used to think healing would make me whole again. But now I understand. It teaches you to love the version of you who lived through the fire." That night, she received a call from the producers of a popular streaming network. They wanted to option her memoir, Still Soft, Still Strong, into a limited series, one that centered on trauma, truth-telling, and emotional survival without dramatizing or romanticizing the pain. They were offering full creative control. At first, she hesitated. Telling her story had already cost her pieces of privacy. But something about this offer felt different, like it could finally open doors for stories like hers to be respected, not just consumed. She agreed. Soon, she was working alongside a screenwriter who had also survived trauma. Together, they built a show that didn't follow the usual victim-to-victory arc, but something more honest, more human. The first episode ended with the main character, based on Grace, sitting alone on a bathroom floor, whispering, "I'm allowed to take up space, even when I'm hurting." When the show premiered, the reaction was overwhelming. Viewers from all backgrounds wrote in, "I saw myself for the first time. You gave me words I didn't know I needed. I finally stopped hiding from my own pain." And then came the invitations Grace never expected. One from a national crisis hotline asking her to serve as their trauma education advisor. Another from a congressional committee drafting a bill to fund trauma-informed care in public schools. She was no longer just a voice. She was becoming an architect for change. Still, she made time for herself. For therapy. For journaling. For long walks and slow mornings. For grief when it returned uninvited. Because even as a public figure, she refused to become a machine. She allowed herself softness, vulnerability, joy. And soon, joy became more present than fear. She met someone, Daniel, a volunteer therapist at one of the shelters her platform supported. He was kind in a quiet way. He didn't try to fix her. He didn't flinch when she said things like, "Sometimes I still have nightmares," or "Certain songs make my chest hurt." He just listened. And when she cried during their third date, completely unplanned, triggered by a passing comment about childhood, he didn't say, "You're too much." He said, I've got time. Their relationship moved slowly. Grace set boundaries, communicated needs, took space when she needed it, and Daniel respected every part. One night, as they sat on her couch wrapped in blankets, watching an old documentary, she turned to him and asked quietly, "Do you ever feel like I'm hard to love?" He looked at her, brow furrowed in confusion. "No," he said. "I feel lucky to know the version of you who chose to keep going. That's not hard. That's beautiful." She smiled, but tears stung her eyes. Not because she didn't believe him, but because for the first time in a very long time she did. Grace didn't need someone to complete her. But being with someone who honored her process? That was healing in a different language. In the following months, she launched a publishing imprint under her foundation, Quiet Power Press, focused on amplifying stories from survivors in their own words. The first anthology sold out in days. The foreword read, "We are not writing to relive the pain. We are writing to reclaim it." Her team grew. Her platform grew. Her peace grew. And through it all, she kept one small frame on her desk, an old photo of her younger self, age 7, missing teeth, with a forced smile. She looked at it every day before she wrote, before she spoke, before she stood on stages. To remind herself, this is who you're doing it for. One day, she got a letter, handwritten, neatly folded, with a familiar name in the corner, Evan. She debated for hours before opening it. Inside was a simple note. "You were right. You weren't broken. I just didn't know how to love someone who had already learned to save herself. I hope you never stop speaking. The world needs you." She folded the note once, placed it in a drawer, and walked away. Not bitter. Not angry. Just finished. Later that night, she posted on her platform, "Closure is not always a conversation. Sometimes it's a choice. And I choose to keep healing, even if the people who hurt me never apologize." And thousands responded, not because they needed her to be a hero, but because she had shown them that healing was not the end of the story. It was the story. And in hers, she was finally whole. The years had a soft way of folding into each other now. Grace no longer measured her worth in how productive she was. She measured it in how many times she chose herself, how often she said no without guilt, how deeply she rested when the world demanded she hustle. And most of all, how well she protected her peace. She still ran her platform unbroken, but she had passed many responsibilities to her team. She focused instead on the work that fed her soul, writing, mentoring, and sitting with survivors in small rooms where no cameras rolled. She believed in those rooms the most, where someone whispered for the first time, "I think it happened to me too." Where shaking hands held pens over intake forms. Where tears were not weakness, but proof that the soul still fought to feel. One evening, Grace sat in a support group she had quietly attended for years, not as a speaker, not as a public figure, but just Grace. They were discussing forgiveness. The facilitator asked, "What does forgiveness look like in your healing?" Someone said it was letting go of anger. Another said it was understanding the trauma their abuser carried. Grace spoke last. "For me," she said, "forgiveness wasn't something I gave to the people who hurt me. It was something I gave to the version of me who didn't know how to leave sooner, who stayed too long, who thought silence would earn love." The room went still. Someone whispered, "Thank you." She wasn't there to impress. She was there to be real. Later that night, Grace walked home under soft rain, her coat clutched around her. She passed couples in shop windows, soft music drifting from cafes, and thought, this is peace. Not perfection. Not absence of pain. But walking home alone, and not feeling empty. Daniel was still in her life, quietly, steadily. He never rushed her. He never asked for more than she could give. And slowly, without pressure or fanfare, he became her partner. They traveled together, sometimes for work, sometimes just to disappear from the world. In Morocco, they slept under stars and danced to drums on rooftops. In Greece, she floated in quiet water and let herself laugh without watching the door. And in Tokyo, she stood in a silent garden and wrote, "Trauma taught me fear. Healing taught me presence." Love taught me softness again. On her 40th birthday, Grace didn't throw a party. She rented a cabin in the mountains and invited only herself. No noise, no emails, just trees, snow, and breath. She made tea on a small stove and reread her first journal, the one she started after Evan left. It was filled with shaky handwriting, tear-stained pages, and small wins. I made it through the night without texting him. I looked in the mirror and didn't flinch. I slept with the lights off. Now, she sat in that cabin with steady hands and peace in her bones. She closed the journal, smiled, and whispered, "Thank you for surviving." When she returned to the city, she was greeted with a surprise. Her platform, Unbroken, had reached 1 million users. There was a message pinned to the homepage from a young girl in India. "My uncle said no one would believe me. Your voice proved him wrong. I told my story. I'm free now." Grace put her hand over her heart and closed her eyes. Not from sadness. From reverence. The same week, she was asked to do a feature interview with a major global magazine. They titled the piece, "The Woman Who Made Healing a Movement." The article traced her journey from survivor to speaker, to founder, to global force. But what Grace loved most was how the journalist ended it. Grace Nolan is not a brand. She is not a trend. She is a woman who stayed, who built, who refused to disappear. And that, more than anything, is what makes her unforgettable. She cried when she read it, because she had fought so long not to disappear. And now she had become a lighthouse. That weekend, she visited her childhood town for the first time in years. The house she grew up in was still there, smaller than she remembered. Peeling paint. The same creaky porch. She didn't knock. She didn't need to. She walked to the sidewalk, stood in front of the home where she first learned silence, and whispered, "I'm not that scared little girl anymore." Then she turned away and left, her heels clicking gently on the pavement. Back in the city, Grace continued her work, but at her pace. No more overfunctioning. No more hustling for worth. Just truth. She taught workshops now, not on how to heal perfectly, but on how to feel safe in your own skin. She told participants, "You don't have to write a book, or start a movement, or speak on a stage. Just breathing without shame is revolutionary." And they believed her, because her voice was not loud. It was honest. One night, as she sat on the balcony with Daniel, she asked, "Do you think I've done enough?" He looked at her gently. "I think you've done what only you could have done, and that will always be enough." She nodded, thinking about the past versions of herself who once begged to be chosen. She was no longer begging. She was becoming. And the life she had built, it was never meant to be perfect. It was meant to be hers. The day Grace received the humanitarian award, she was not wearing a designer gown. She was in a simple black pantsuit, her hair in a soft bun, her face calm. Not because she was indifferent, but because she no longer needed the world to know she had made it. She already knew. The room was packed, philanthropists, CEOs, authors, journalists. A large screen behind her displayed Grace Nolan for redefining the narrative around trauma and healing. When her name was announced, a quiet cheer rippled through the audience. She stood, walked slowly to the stage, and smiled at the rows of people clapping for her. She did not bow her head in humility. She stood tall, because humility was not shrinking, it was standing firm and saying, "I did the work." She began her speech with a story. "I was told once," she said softly, "that I was too broken to be loved, too damaged to be chosen, that I was exhausting." A murmur moved through the room. Grace continued, "But the truth is, what exhausted them was not my brokenness. It was my truth. And I stopped apologizing for telling it." Applause erupted. But she held up a hand. "Let me say this clearly," she added. "I did not heal to be admirable. I healed to live." Later that night, alone in her hotel room, the award sat on her nightstand. She didn't touch it much. What mattered more was the email she read just before bed. It was from a young woman named Tessa, age 19. "I told my mother today. I cried so hard I thought I would pass out. But I kept hearing your voice from your podcast. Let the truth tremble, but let it out. I did. And she believed me. She hugged me. I feel clean. I feel free. Thank you. Grace closed the laptop and wept. Not from pain, but because her voice had become a lifeline. The next morning, she met with a film director interested in adapting the Unbroken story into a global education initiative. They wanted to bring trauma literacy into high schools around the world through short films, peer-led modules, and access to free resources in over 30 languages. Grace asked one question. Will the students see themselves in it? The director nodded. Not just the perfect ones. All of them. She agreed. It became one of the most meaningful projects of her life, because she remembered what it was like to sit in a classroom, dissociating while the world moved on. To smile on cue. To say, I'm fine, and pray no one asked again. She wanted to reach those kids. And now she could. The campaign rolled out across 5 continents. Teenagers submitted their own stories anonymously through the app. Teachers received trauma-informed training. Parents listened. Conversations changed. And once, in a classroom in Brazil, a 16-year-old boy stood up during a group activity and said, I thought I was broken, but now I think maybe I'm just healing. Grace saw the clip, and again cried, because this was bigger than her. One evening, she sat on the floor of her apartment surrounded by letters from survivors across the globe. She was organizing them into themes for a book she was curating, letters to the versions of us who survived. Each letter would begin with Dear Me. One read, Dear Me, I'm sorry for how often I told you to shut up and smile. I didn't know softness was sacred. Another, Dear Me, you deserve to be believed the first time. And another, Dear Me, you are not disgusting. You are divine. Grace read each one aloud. Slowly, reverently, because they were holy in their own way. She didn't rush the book. It took her 2 years. But when it was released, it became an international bestseller, not because it was polished, but because it was honest. And honesty, she had learned, is what saves people. One day, as she visited the trauma center her foundation helped fund, she noticed a young man sketching in a corner. He was in his early 20s. Quiet. Intense. Grace knelt beside him. What are you drawing? She asked. He turned the sketch pad. It was a portrait of a woman standing barefoot on a cracked road, one hand over her heart, the other holding a torch. The title underneath read, She Chose Herself. Grace felt her breath catch. Is this based on someone? She asked. He nodded slowly. You. She sat with that for a moment, heart full. He spoke again. I was in a dark place when I found your book. I didn't think men like me could heal. I didn't think we were allowed to. Grace shook her head softly. Everyone is allowed. Everyone deserves. And she meant it, because she had long let go of the idea that healing had a gender, a race, a class, or a shape. It was universal. It belonged to anyone brave enough to want it. She framed the sketch and hung it in her home office, right above her desk. Every morning, she looked at it before replying to messages, before planning her week, before stepping back into her work. Not to admire herself, but to remember the journey, to honor the girl she once was, to keep going for every soul who hadn't yet begun. One afternoon, Daniel came home to find Grace curled up on the couch with a box of old photos. He sat beside her. Memory lane? He asked. She nodded. I'm thinking of writing something new. He raised an eyebrow. Another book? She smiled. A children's book, about a little girl who thinks her cracks make her ugly, until she learns that light gets in through the broken parts. He leaned his head against hers. That sounds perfect. Grace reached for her notebook and scribbled the first line. Once upon a time, there was a girl who carried the sun in her scars. She paused, smiling, because the world had tried to name her broken. And yet, here she was, whole in her own way, with a voice that touched hearts, with a love that never demanded silence, with a life she had built, brick by brave brick. Not despite the cracks, but because of them. Grace stood quietly on the balcony of her lake house, watching the morning light stretch across the calm water. Birds skimmed the surface, and the wind carried the scent of pine and something faintly sweet. Lavender, maybe. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and exhaled slowly. This was peace. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just real. She had never imagined her life would look like this. Tranquil mornings instead of anxious ones, soft love instead of sharp silence, purpose without pain. But here she was. She had not overcome her trauma in the way the world liked to package it. She had grown around it, like a tree around a wound. Inside, Daniel was making tea. They had grown comfortable in each other's rhythms. There was no pretending between them. She did not perform healing. He did not pretend to understand it all. They simply met each other where they were every day, again and again. Grace's phone buzzed. It was her editor. Your children's book hit #1 in 3 countries. We're being flooded with letters from parents and teachers. They say the story is changing how kids understand feelings. She smiled and replied simply, "Let the light keep spreading." She set the phone down. She did not need to post about it. She did not need applause. She had learned the difference between visibility and value. That afternoon, Grace hosted a small circle of women at the lake house, survivors from different backgrounds, different continents, some with platforms, some still finding their voice. They sat barefoot in a circle on the deck, cups of tea in hand, sun warming their skin. They were not there to network. They were there to witness each other. One by one, they spoke truths they had never shared aloud. One said, "I still flinch when someone says, 'Calm down.'" Another whispered, "Sometimes I miss the person who hurt me, and I hate myself for it." Grace listened, nodded, held space. When it was her turn, she said, "I don't have a 5-step formula for healing. I only have this: softness is strength, and staying is brave." A hush fell over the group. Then tears. Then laughter. Later, one woman lingered behind. She approached Grace slowly. "You changed everything for me," she said. "Not because you had all the answers, but because you made it okay to have none." Grace took her hands. "That means everything," she said. "Because for a long time, I thought I had to be whole before I could help anyone. But wholeness is not a destination. It's a direction." They hugged. A long, quiet hug that said, "We survived." That evening, Grace sat at her desk by the window and opened a document titled Legacy Notes. It wasn't for a book or a speech. It was for the people she loved, for the ones who would carry pieces of her voice after she was gone. She began to type. "If you're reading this, I want you to know, healing does not mean you'll never hurt again. It means the hurting will no longer define you. You are more than what was done to you. You are what you choose to do with it now." She closed the laptop gently. She wasn't writing it out of fear. She was writing it out of fullness. Grace had built scholarships for survivors in underserved communities. She had funded trauma-informed programs in schools. She had passed laws, held space, raised voices. But more than anything, she had made healing human. Not clinical, not cold, human. Years passed. Gray crept into her hair. Lines softened around her eyes. But her voice, her truth, only grew stronger. She became a guest lecturer at universities, often sitting cross-legged on desks, speaking plainly. Once, a student raised his hand and asked, "Do you ever wish your trauma never happened?" She paused, then said, "Of course. I would never romanticize it, but wishing it away won't erase it. I don't live for revenge anymore. I live for redemption." She paused again. "And I don't mean redemption for what was done to me. I mean reclaiming the joy that was stolen." Applause was quiet, but the tears in the room were loud. At home, she spent more time painting, something she had abandoned in her 20s. Now it was therapy, not for display, just for breath. She painted sunsets over oceans, women with eyes like storms, children dancing barefoot under stars. One painting she hung above her fireplace, a dark-skinned girl with braids, standing in a field of broken mirrors, her reflection made of gold. Daniel said it was his favorite. One winter night, they sat by the fire reading. He looked over and asked softly, "What's the proudest moment of your life?" Grace thought for a moment. "It wasn't a speech," she said, "or a book deal, or an award." He waited. "It was the first time I said no and didn't explain myself." He laughed quietly. "That sounds just like you." She grinned, because that was the truth. Not the grand gestures, but the small rebellions, the quiet boundaries, the sacred refusals. She fell asleep that night with a journal on her chest and a smile on her face. In her dream, she stood in a long hallway lined with mirrors. But this time she didn't flinch. She walked past each reflection with her head held high, because now she understood. She was not broken glass. She was the light that passed through it. When the time came, many years later, for Grace's story to be honored one final time, the world didn't just remember her as a survivor or an activist. They remembered her as someone who redefined what it meant to rise. Her memorial was simple. By her own request. A bench in a quiet garden, under a willow tree. A plaque that read, "She turned her pain into shelter." And beside it, a quote etched in stone. "You are allowed to take up space. You always were." People came from everywhere. To sit. To breathe. To cry. But mostly to remember that once there was a woman named Grace Nolan who was told she was too broken, and who proved through every scar, every choice, every word, that healing is not a destination. It is a life, lived boldly, softly, truthfully. And when you choose yourself, day after day, that is the most powerful story of all.